Continuação da leitura do livro The New Map. O epílogo diz Net Zero. A leitura está em inglês, pois o livro está em inglês. Joe Biden wasted no time. It had only been a few hours since his swearing in as President of the United States on January 20, 2021. Sitting for the first time at the desk in the Oval Office, he signed an executive order that would make good, he said, on the commitment I made that we will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord as of today. With that, there could be no doubt that climate would be, as he pledged, one of the top priorities on his administration. Former Secretary of State John Kerry was appointed U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, with the job of negotiating the next stage of a global compact. Gina McCarthy, former head of the Environmental Protection Agency, was designated to lead domestic climate policy from the White House, and every cabinet secretary was assigned a climate mandate. The new administration made its goals clear to decarbonize electricity by 2035 and then achieve by 2050 the big target for the entire United States, net zero carbon, otherwise known as carbon neutrality. Other countries were already on board. France, Britain, and the European Commission had all in 2019 adopted the goal of carbon neutrality, with Prime Minister adopted the goal of carbon neutrality with Boris Johnson, subsequently promising to make Britain the Saudi Arabia of wind. In Asia, both South Korea and Japan adopted 2050 targets, but the most important commitment of all, owing to a scale of its emissions, was that of China. At the United Nations in September 2020, President Xi Jinping announced that China, too, was taking decisive steps to net zero carbon, but he had a caveat, a warning, reaching the goal by 2060. China, which produces about 30% of anthropogenic CO2, would need more time to shift away from its coal-based economy. The pledges added up. By spring of 2021, over 70% of the world's total CO2 emissions and 80% of world GDP were under the net zero umbrella. To accelerate decarbonization and mark the United States' return to the Paris Accords in April 2021, Biden hosted a virtual Leaders Climate Summit, at which he pledged to reduce U.S. emissions by at least 50% by 2030 against a baseline of 2005. This would be a very big leap up from 2019, when emissions had been down 13%, largely owing to natural gas replacing coal in electric generation. Achieving such a goal would require, as the New York Times put it, a drastic overhaul of American society, which could not be achieved by market forces alone. It would require extensive government intervention across the entire economy through regulation, subsidized projects, incentives, penalties, directing of private investment, and very large amounts of government money. As one example, the administration's proposed $2.3 trillion infrastructure package apportioned 50% more money to electric vehicle promotion than to roads, bridges, ports, and waterways. While China's President Xi reiterated his 2060 target at the summit, he pushed back against the criticism of China's emissions, saying that developed countries had the responsibility to increase climate ambition and action, which would compensate for their emissions during their own industrializations. Net zero carbon has come to be the global target for meeting the Paris objective of holding temperature increases to no more than 2 degrees centigrade, or better, 1.5 degrees, above pre-industrial levels. In Fahrenheit, that's either a 3.6 degree or a 2.7 degree increase. In the years since the 2015 agreement alignment with Paris is no longer only the purview of governments. Financial firms representing many tens of trillions of dollars of assets had added climate risk to the screens through which they make investments and lending decisions. Over 30 central banks have elevated climate into their mandates. Climate disclosure, aiming to demonstrate how company strategies accord with the Paris goals, has become a requirement of company reporting. All of this increasingly focused on Glasgow, COP 2016, no, it's 2006 to come. The UN Climate Conference, that is the successor of the Paris 2015. The overriding objectives of Glasgow is to translate aspirations into climate actions, laws, regulations, and investments, to accelerate emission reductions, to get to carbon neutrality, and to codify 1.5 degrees as the benchmark, not 2 degrees. To hasten global carbon neutrality and protect its own industries, the European Union developed a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Essentially, that means carbon-related tariffs on goods coming from countries that do not have the same ambition as Europe, that is, that do not have the same tough standards that the EU is imposing on its own carbon-emitting companies. It is expected that this will be contentions with Europe's trading partners and challenged in the World Trade Organization. One striking difference between Europe and the United States is in the degree of consensus. In most of Europe, strong climate policies are embraced across the political spectrum. By contrast, divisions remain in the United States about policies, science, and government spending. By now, the what has become clear in terms of energy transition, net zero carbon, but what remains uncertain is the how. How to get all the way to carbon neutrality in a global economy that currently relies on fossil fuels for 80% of its energy. It is the great question that will be on the global agenda for years to come. The question is further complicated by the different definitions of energy transition. For some, it means no carbon-based energy. For others, it means carbon capture, abatement, and offsets, like to cancel the effect of the carbon already in the atmosphere. A rich country in the Northern Europe has much more flexibility than a developing country, and the wealth to pursue its ambitions. India, with its very large and young population, will increasingly become one of the main engines of the global economy. But with hundreds of millions of people in poverty, the country is by necessity pursuing multiple paths of energy transition. Very ambitious goals for wind and solar, but also commercial cooking fuels for people in villages as an alternative to wood and waste, and an expanded natural gas system to reduce pollution. As Prime Minister Narendra Modi put it, the need is to think both logically and ecologically. The very fact that so many nations have voluntarily embraced something so fundamental and so challenging as carbon neutrality, is remarkable. What makes it even more remarkable is that much of this was done during COVID-19 time, when lockdowns became ubiquitous and economic activity suppressed. But then, something else happened that was also remarkable. The time needed for vaccine development shrank from the traditional 5 to 10 years to less than 1 year. If the threat was big enough, speed was all that mattered, said Noubar Afeyan, co-founder of Moderna, which produced one of the leading vaccines in record time. The pandemic, he added, gave the necessary permission to leap technologically over the standard ways of innovating. As vaccinations were rolled out into people's arms, despite variants in the coronavirus, the world was poised for a strong economic recovery that would propel global GDP back to and then above the pre-COVID year of 2019. As economies opened up again, the unprecedented collapse in oil demand of the spring of 2020, which had driven petroleum prices down into negative territory and pushed the global oil industry toward collapse, came to an end. The OPEC Plus deal that resulted and the massive cutbacks in supply had brought prices back from the abyss, the deep hole, as the prospect of vaccines became reality and as economic activity rebounded, oil demand rose, lifting oil prices back to a level that would permit new investment in oil and gas projects. The U.S. shale industry had been particularly hard hit, but with prices recovering, the shale industry stabilized, and companies turned to mergers and scale as ways to bring down costs and ensure competitiveness. The second shale revolution also continued as companies sought to deliver on the pledge that they would stay within cash flow and return money to investors. U.S. oil output, which in February 2020 had peaked at 13 million barrels per day, 2.5 times what it had been in 2008, fell to around 11 million barrels a day by the end of that year. Yet, that still left the United States as the world's largest oil producer. Moreover, the year ended with something of great significance, though hardly noticed. For the first time in 72 years, since the tanker with Middle East oil had sailed to the United States in 1948, the United States on a net basis was energy independent. In 2008, the United States spent almost $400 billion on oil imports. In 2020, that number was zero, meaning that hundreds of billions of dollars remained inside the US economy each year. But with the Biden administration so focused on climate, shale was not regarded as such as a national asset. Indeed, Biden had been one of the few candidates in the Democratic primaries who had not wanted to ban fracking. During the fall of 2020 campaign, he had gone out of his way to say, I will not ban fracking. Let me repeat, I will not ban fracking, he said in Pennsylvania, a state that was benefiting from the shale revolution. Unstated was the reality that a ban on fracking, even if the federal government had the power to impose such, would really be an import oil policy because, whatever the source, almost all of the 280 million cars in the United States would need gasoline. If they were to run, Moreover, in previous years, as a former member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and its sometime chairman Biden had warned against the cost to our foreign policy of our dependence on imported oil, Shale provided an answer to his concern. Still, once in office, Biden imposed freezes on oil and gas leasing on federal lands, pending review on climate impacts. The federal government owns a lot of the United States' 46% of the territory of the 11 western states and 61% of Alaska, but most of it is not prospective oil and gas. The main impact of the freeze was on the part of the Permian, that in New Mexico about a third of the state's government revenue comes from oil and gas. In Alaska and in offshore waters, the last of which produces almost 2 million barrels per day, which is equivalent to Nigeria's output. The effects of the pandemic-induced 2020 collapse will continue to be felt by the global industry. The price collapse had forced the slashing of both budget and investment in new supplies. Moreover, at the same time, the global oil and gas industry is having to adapt to a world that is aiming at net zero. Some features are common across most large companies. They are focusing on reducing emissions of CO2 and methane from their operational and are putting increased emphasis on innovation, digital applications, new technologies, and corporate venture capital investing. They generally remain committed to expanding LNG and as a lower carbon fuel that can replace coal in electric generation, primarily in Asia. Many of the major national oil companies are moving in the same directions, but they differ in crucial aspects of their overall strategies. Some are doubling down on efficiency in their operations and developing low carbon and carbon management businesses. Others are making more dramatic changes. In response to government regulation, investor pressure, and the demands of society, these companies are seeking to implement transitions in their own corporate identities. This is the shift from being IOCs, international oil companies, to becoming IECs, integrated energy companies. Primarily, this means moving into the electricity business in multiple ways, as generators and traders and even retail providers, as operators of wind and solar, as owners of solar and battery companies, and as deployers of charging stations for electric vehicles. Some are going into offshore wind, leveraging their capabilities from their offshore oil and gas operations. Some are saying that they are aiming to take responsibility not only for their own emissions, but also for those of their customers. For instance, the emissions come out of auto tall pipes and power plants, what are called Scope 3 emissions, though they vary in their project levels of future investment in oil and gas production. The integrated energy companies recognize that they will need revenues from oil and gas to fund their large-scale migration into electricity and new technologies. One who looks with a particular perspective on this move by oil companies into electricity is Ignacio Galán. When Galán became CEO of Iberdrola in 2001, the company was a Spanish electric utility based on coal, nuclear, and hydro. He pushed the company toward renewables, specifically wind, at a time when wind was still relatively expensive and generally seen as marginal. Owing to his commitment to wind, Galán himself was sometimes regarded in some energy circles as a bit of a modern-day Don Quixote, Who was tilting at windmills? Not many believed that what we were doing made any sense, we recalled. We had a lot of people opposed. Today, however, Galan can look with a certain bemusement at the move by oil companies into electricity. For Iberdrola is a renewable energy major with operations on 4 continents. It is the largest wind generation company in the world outside China in terms of capacity and through its American subsidiaries. The third largest wind generator in the United States. We used to regard oil companies as our enemy, he said. Now they are becoming our competitors and sometimes our partners. The falling costs of solar and wind are one of the bulwarks of net zero. They have come down dramatically, solar as much as 80% over the last decade. Wind power costs by over 50% since 2010. These costs will likely continue to fall further, driven by economies of scale, increasing efficiencies and technological evolution. For many utilities, solar and wind have become very competitive options, in some markets the most competitive. They still, however, face the challenge of intermittency, the big swings in generation when the sun is or is not shining and the wind is or is not blowing, as well as of being available at peak times for consumption, which means for homes often around dinner time. The new frontier for wind is offshore, where stronger and deadier winds could make wind energy more like base load. That is most consistent, however, costs still have to come down substantially for offshore to get to scale globally. Net zero has given new momentum and urgency to the development of innovations across a wide front of technologies. But, at least for now, 3 technology areas stand out in the march for net zero. One is carbon capture. As discussed in Chapter 44, there is widespread recognition that carbon neutrality requires, as the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change puts it, negative emissions, that is, use of carbon dioxide removal. The projected overall supply-demand in numbers for the decades ahead don't work without it. Under any realistic scenario, oil and gas will remain significant components of the energy mix 3 decades from now. 1 billion cars with internal combustion engines are still likely to be on the road in 2050, and if not 1 billion, then 750 million. The world will still be using steel, cement, and fertilizer, the production of all of which releases emissions. One way to remove carbon is by augmenting the lungs of the world that are part of planet Earth's natural carbon balance through the nature-based solutions discussed early in this book. At the top of that list for many is reforestation. Another way is through engineering, carbon capture and storage, CCS, gathering the CO2 emitted by industrial facilities and then piping it to a location where it can be sequestered underground. In Texas, a facility for direct air capture, DAC, is being developed to grab CO2 directly from the air, and work continues on putting captured carbon to use in, for instance, the manufacture of cement. The second area is hydrogen. Now front and center, it may be the most abundant element in the universe, as well as the lightest. But when it comes to energy, despite previous bouts of hype, it has remained on the sidelines. That has changed. It has now become the new star of the energy transition, at least the potential star. Until now, hydrogen has had an important but limited market in industrial applications. Hydrogen has the highest energy density of any common fuel, which is why hydrogen compressed from its gaseous state into a liquid at -422 degrees Fahrenheit is also one of the main fuels used to blast rockets into outer space. But it is now coming to be seen by many as a fuel that will be crucial for getting to net zero. Hydrogen or hydrogen-derived fuels could provide the power for heavy trucks and shipping, but a much bigger hole would be to replace natural gas as an industrial fuel and for heating. Hydrogen could also provide storage for electricity. Renewable electricity could be used to make hydrogen, which could then be used as fuel when wind and solar output diminishes. Some European Union studies project up to a quarter of the energy needs of the EU being met by hydrogen by 2050. Achieving anything close to that would be a huge undertaking in terms of sheer scale. Two big obstacles stand in the way of realizing the hydrogen hope: the cost and the pathways. And that gets to the matter of color. And here we must turn to the palette. Gray hydrogen is the hydrogen conventionally produced today as an industrial fuel, most commonly from natural gas. Brown hydrogen, if it is made from coal in China. But conventional hydrogen production results in carbon dioxide emissions. If something is to be done with the emissions, that requires carbon capture. With the addition of carbon capture, gray hydrogen is transmuted into blue hydrogen. The greatest excitement is around green hydrogen, which would be produced by using electricity to split a water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen molecules. What would make it green is the use of electricity generated by wind and solar, but currently the cost is higher than that of blue hydrogen and much higher than the cost of conventional gray hydrogen. So there is also a variant, hydrogen produced with nuclear energy, variously known as yellow hydrogen or pink hydrogen, and other colors generated by other production processes. The European Union is leading the global charge for hydrogen as a replacement fuel, and hydrogen strategies and initiatives are proliferating across the continent. Across the world, countries and companies with existing or potential low-cost and abundant electricity are beginning to jostle to become hydrogen exporters, and some see the potential for a global trade of hydrogen. At this point, the expectations for hydrogen are much greater than the capacity to deliver it in large volumes, because of the great scale involved and the engineering capabilities required, and because the energy industry has the familiarity of working with it. Hydrogen has become a focus for energy companies around the world. It's also of great interest to governments that recognize that they need a scale resource that is not intermittent. As a result, mounting efforts will go into hydrogen with the hope of elevating by 2050 the world's lightest element into a really heavy-duty player in the world's energy supply. The third technology area is batteries and electricity storage. The move towards electric vehicles and rapid growth of intermittent renewable energy generation are making improving batteries along with scaling up supply chain and manufacturing a strategic priority. The largest part of the growth will come from cars as automakers pivot to electric. China, pushed by the government in the world's largest electric car market, and California has banned the selling of gasoline cars in the state after 2035. And Britain is aiming for 2030. A week after President Biden signed the executive order on climate change, General Motors CEO Mary Barra announced the company's ambition to give up on gasoline and to produce only electric cars from 2035 onwards. GM already has the Bolt and an electric Cadillac coming. Ford has brought out an electric version of the F-150, the F-150, and the best-selling pickup truck for almost half a century. Other companies are coming out with their own targets. Volvo plans to go all electric by 2030. The switch, said Volvo CEO Håkan Samuelsson, is based on the expectation that legislation as well as a rapid expansion of accessible high-quality charging infrastructure will accelerate customer acceptance of fully electric cars. One of his senior colleagues added, "There are some leaps of faith and some bets that need to be made for these roads to be viable. The cost of lithium-ion batteries has fallen dramatically in recent years as manufacturing has scaled up, but continued cost and technology improvements are crucial for electric cars to compete with gasoline-powered cars in terms of convenience and costs without subsidies. That is also the case for what is known as the hybrid combination of renewables and longer duration battery storage to compete with power from conventional electric generation. This will involve not only improvements in today's batteries, but also developing new and different battery technologies. One other big battery issue is emerging disposal. What to do with the growing number of batteries with their toxic material that will reach the end of their lives in the years ahead. To address this, a rapid build-out of recycling facilities will need to be paired with innovation to improve recovery rates and costs. And policy and regulation will energize the help establish a circular supply chain. Bem, termino por aqui e continuo a leitura no próximo áudio. Tchau, tchau!